Good evening, welcome to Midlands Today this Thursday evening. Tonight, the growing role of private enterprise in the NHS.
A private sector company has signed a partnership deal with South Warwickshire NHS Foundation Trust, which runs Warwick Hospital. Although nothing is yet confirmed, the deal could pave the way for Warwick Hospital and the company Serco to take over the running of a neighbouring hospital.
That's the George Eliot in Nuneaton, which is struggling and looking for new ideas. Our health correspondent, Michele Paduano, has the details.
Like all small hospitals, the George Eliot in Nuneaton is cash-strapped. It's had a high death rate and difficulty recruiting staff. Only last week it was announced that children won't be treated here overnight anymore. So the George Eliot is looking for help either from the NHS or private sector. The chief executive here has welcomed the link-up between Warwick and Serco.
I'm sure it's a great announcement for the people of South Warwick, and if South Warwick and Serco come forward with the bid to work with us, we will look at that as we need to look at all bids that come forward.
Warwick Hospital is part of South Warwickshire Foundation NHS Trust. That means it can act like a business. Serco is promising to bring in new ideas here and new technology for patients across Warwickshire. But both organisations have their eyes on running George Eliot Hospital. Both South Warwickshire NHS Foundation Trust and Serco have expressed an interest in running this hospital. A reliable source has told me that they're now considering putting in a bid together as part of this deal because there are business opportunities for both parties. With an annual turnover of nearly £2.5 billion, Serco is possibly the biggest company you've never heard of. It runs London's Docklands Light Railway, education departments in Leeds, Walsall and Stoke-on-Trent, and Coventry Airport's air traffic control. In Cornwall, it's been in trouble with its out-of-hours GP service. Back in Nuneaton, not everyone has welcomed this deal or more private sector involvement in the NHS.
Sugarcoating on the bitter pill of privatisation. They know that the public is massively opposed to the hospital being taken over by a private company, and so they're going into partnership with a private company as essentially a smokescreen, bring them in through the back door.
In 2003, Good Hope Hospital in Sutton Coldfield was taken over by a private company, Sector. 2 years later, it had to be bailed out with £11 million of debts. Nuneaton's MP believes the private sector does have something still to offer.
All sorts of different models are being pursued here in terms of what they're looking to do, and they're both with the private and within the NHS. But my priority for the people of Nuneaton is to have a high quality hospital.
The George Eliot is awaiting a decision from the Department of Health, but expects to decide who exactly will take over in the next 6 to 12 months. Michele Paduano, BBC Midlands Today.
Well, joining us now from our studio in Stoke-on-Trent is Professor Callum Payton from Keele University, an expert in health politics. Thanks for joining us this evening, Professor.
Now, it's a pleasure.
Usually we know of hospitals having some services being run by private companies. The difference here is they could be running a whole hospital.
Yes, that's absolutely right. I mean, both under Tony Blair's government and under the present government, there's a tendency to define the NHS not in terms of the hospitals and other service providers, but in terms of the money. In other words, it's the NHS because it's tax funded. So you'll find NHS Birmingham, NHS Stoke-on-Trent, and the hospitals are squeezed out of that. They're just marketplace actors, and I think that's a mistake, and I think there's no evidence to suggest that that's the right way to go forward, more importantly.
Yeah, I mean, privatisation is a dirty word to some. Will it sweeten it a bit if it's in conjunction with the NHS, do you think?
Well, I mean, privatisation is, defined differently. For example, the Secretary of State recently, Andrew Lansley, the previous Secretary of State, used to say we'll never privatise the NHS. But he was speaking a little bit disingenuously, I think, because what he meant is we'll never, on his watch anyway, privatise the funding of the NHS. In other words, it will be tax funded. But there's been a lot of privatisation of provision. And I'm not against where there's a specific reason to let somebody's expertise get involved in the NHS to do that. And as you say, there have been reasons when certain support services have been run privately. It hasn't always worked well, but the idea that you can contract out the whole management of the hospital to a profit-making concern, which is basically looking to take profits across the whole public sector, I mean, again, I'd ask, where's the evidence that that's the way to go forward? In fact, such little evidence as there is, you alluded to in your report, it hasn't actually been tried very often. Alan Milburn, in fact, under New Labour's government, announced this on a big scale, and, it was a bang which became a whimper, because there was one example of it, which was a fiasco, the Good Hope Hospital that you've referred to.
But it all does sound highly lucrative. I think a similar company, Serco, a similar company to Serco, identified the George Eliot as part of £8 billion worth of business opportunities in the NHS. It's astonishing.
Yes, I mean it is. I mean, I think the trouble is that the debate gets tied up with the need to change hospital services and rationalise them and reconfigure them in the jargon. In other words, you know, have more specialised centres and maybe smaller district hospitals and so on and so forth. I mean, that's an agenda which I think should be wholly separate from privatisation. I mean, I'll just ask a simple question. Who in Serco will be actually the health management experts who will be running the hospital? Well, I mean, I may be wrong about this, but my guess is they will be ex-NHS managers. So, I mean, if the NHS, after decades of leadership development, is unable to provide the leadership to run these hospitals, then I think one must ask questions of those in charge of leadership development and the chief executive of the NHS. And I mean that quite seriously. Why on earth, after all these years, is this necessary?
Professor Payton, we'll leave it there. Thank you.
Coming up later in the